Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Clements, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thanks so much for joining us for the third and final event in this series titled The Road to Zero-Emission Trucks. The focus today is on fleets and freight shippers. We're going to be taking a look at environmental initiatives and upcoming regulations that are steering small and large fleet and freight shippers towards zero-emissions replacements of their diesel-powered trucks. It's a big deal. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsor, the Environmental Defense Fund, for supporting today's event and this series. Today, we're going to dive into the public policy initiatives needed to make electric trucks more affordable and available, the biggest challenges for fleet leaders and shippers, and what changes are necessary to arrive at zero-emission vehicle adoption within the supply chain. There's some tongue twisters there. Before we begin, I'm going to bring our fantastic lineup of speakers here in a few minutes, but a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag TheHillETrucks. We're broadcasting live and we'll take your questions throughout the program. As with any live stream, you could experience occasional trouble with the video, and refreshing the page will fix all of the problems, I guarantee it. Joining us to kick off the program is Senator Ron Wyden from Oregon. He chairs the Senate Finance Committee. Senator Wyden has introduced the Clean Energy for America Act, which seeks to eliminate tax incentives for fossil fuels and create tax credits for clean electricity and transportation production. Very key to this topic. It will also help to grow the manufacturing supply chain in the United States. Senator, it's great to see you. And so let's just get right to it. You know, with the Clean Energy for America Act, I think when you're trying to sort of move the subsidization structure of our energy from fossil fuels to clean energy, let me just ask, who is the villain in the story?
Well, probably history. And let me just kind of walk you through it. Essentially, over the last 100 years, the Senate Finance Committee, which has jurisdiction over taxes, would be faced with people coming in and saying, let's have this tax break or that tax break or some other tax break for practically every type of energy source. And it got to the point where the tax code now is just a broken down, jumbled mix. It has been based on short-term extensions. Some of them had a shelf life barely up to a carton of eggs, and it didn't provide the certainty and predictability we need for transformational energy policy, whether it's in transportation or any other area. So what we did at the beginning of this year, we took the 44 separate tax breaks for energy that are now on the federal books. As I say, some of them relics to yesteryear. And we deposited them in the dustbin of history. And then we said, instead of those 44, let's have one for clean energy, one for clean transportation, and one for energy efficiency. And then we said, with this, we will have a tech-neutral, market-oriented system with a very straightforward lodestar. And that is, to get the tax savings, you actually have to reduce carbon emissions. And the more you reduce carbon emissions, the bigger your tax savings. And for the Senate Finance Committee, this is the most transformative bill in over 100 years as it relates to protecting the environment. Never before under our tax code has anybody said you would actually tie tax savings to a very much needed policy, which is reducing carbon emissions. That came out of the Senate Finance Committee, and we're going to push very hard to make it part of the final package that is now under discussion between the Senate and the House.
Now, Senator, I understand it is zero emissions targets and our climate targets and climate change. Sometimes there are other equities that come up, like energy independence. It's one of the drivers of the technology that went into, fracking and, gas. And I'm just interested it sounds to me you have great clarity of purpose in where you are, but sometimes there are other equities that people would raise, if you you undo this, then you undo energy independence. I mean, how do you respond to those critics?
Let's be clear about this. Energy would get all the same tax breaks that every other business would get. That's number one. And number two, we say that when you reduce carbon emissions, no matter what type of energy you are, we're looking for ways to get you under this umbrella. So I believe that this is the kind of market-oriented, tech-neutral approach where everybody can say, finally, our government is sending a clear message so that with predictability and certainty, you as a company can know where you stand. When you reduce carbon emissions, you're eligible for these tax savings, and the bigger the reduction, the bigger your savings.
It's fascinating. I am also aware that this pandemic, which created this seizure and this, this shock in America, that we didn't make everything in this country, that global supply chains, that production was outside the country, key things we needed. I'm just interested as you succeed in making tax incentives for this transition, where is the United States compared to countries like China or India or Europe when it comes to an ecosystem around EVs and around clean energy? Are we where we should be, or do you think we are substantially behind other countries that have been at this for a while?
I do believe that we have to be bolder and be more transformative with policies like I just mentioned. There is no question that China in particular, over the last decade, really moved in a very bold way. And certainly during the Trump years, it's not been a priority to promote renewable energy. And frankly, it's not correct to say it's only been those 4 years. If you look back even to the Obama years, you didn't have the kind of long-term certainty and predictability and rewards, actual tangible rewards for carbon reduction emissions that I'm talking about.
How much of your bill, let's say the bill, I mean, what's the status of your bill, and do you think, and are pieces of it being absorbed into other things the Biden administration is pulling in, like the infrastructure bill, like this other? Because I know, the clarity that you just shared on this tax bill and this tax plan is very interesting. But is that embedded in what Joe Biden is trying to basically put forward too?
The Biden administration worked very closely with us on this. And they have come to understand that the kind of specifics about the bill we allow, for example, companies take either a production tax credit or investment tax credit, is very attractive. The House of Representatives has already expressed an interest in that. So I think there is an opportunity to come together. What I do believe is especially transformative is to lock in permanently the lodestar that says that you're going to be tech neutral, market oriented, and the more you actually achieve, what you achieve in terms of reducing carbon emissions is what is pegged to your savings.
It's, when I think about it, and I think about the fact that when I worked in Jeff Bingaman's office, Senator Bingaman, in the 1990s, and he was, very involved in Energy Committee. I was just sort of interested in the absence of kind of a comprehensive energy plan in the 1990s of the U.S. Senate, because it was always, they're always silos and separated. Your plan is technology neutral. It's just sort of across the board. Is the Finance Committee finally creating the energy strategy we've needed as other committees have been unable to do that?
It is, and that's probably the one I've got to quit on because it is such a hectic day with all the budget negotiations. I have long felt that what has happened over the years, particularly with the grants and with the temporary tax incentives and the like, what you really saw was anybody who got to an influential member of Congress who was well positioned basically got their idea pushed in to the tax system. And I want to get away from it. And Jeff Bingaman was chairman when I sat next to him, and he's in retirement in New Mexico. We had lunch with Jeff and Ann a couple of years ago. I like to think this is his kind of idea. On the finance committee over the years, people had talked about something like this, but nobody had ever locked it into place. So why don't we do this? I so appreciate the Hill giving us the opportunity to really lay this out with kind of the substance and the specifics. And with your leave, I'd love to come back. We'll have a further discussion about vehicles and a variety of other kinds of questions. And with your leave, let's put this in to be continued, okay?
Well, Senator Ron Wyden, chair of the Senate Finance Committee, wonderful conversation, author of the Clean Energy for America Act. Thank you so much for sharing your candid thoughts with us today, and we look forward to having that conversation down the road.
Thanks so much.
And now it's time to hear from our panel. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Jane Lind, professor of civil materials and environmental engineering at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Stephen Molk, project implementation manager of zero-emission delivery initiatives at IKEA, cool store. Russell Musgrove, managing director of global vehicles at FedEx Express. And Jimmy O'Day, deputy director of trucks at CalStart, a nonprofit that works with businesses and governments to develop clean transportation solutions. Welcome to you all. So this is a big topic, EV trucks, what's going on. But let me just start out with Jane and ask an innocent question, trying to think of our audience that's listening to this right now and understanding why this is happening. Why are EV vehicles coming online? What's the big driver? What is the big driver as you see it?
So obviously the climate change is the big driver, right, for zero emission vehicles. And we know that transportation is the main contributors to the CO2 emissions and this greenhouse gas emissions and other pollutants. So in the past many decades, the Environmental Protection Agency (EPA) has really put an effort to curb the vehicle emissions, particularly focusing on the passenger vehicles. But I think now it's time to maybe shift the focus, or not. I mean, obviously not entirely. We still have to do, work on the passenger vehicles. But now I think it's time to probably shift some focus on the electric trucks, the electrification of trucks.
And so when it comes, we're going to be discussing, fleets and the large scale deployment of EVs. When it comes to a scale of like 1 to 10 in the United States, and 10 being the maximum, like we've done the transition. Where is the United States now in that journey, Jane?
In terms of the electrification of trucks, or overall
trucks and fleets. I mean, I'm just interested, is this the very beginning of the journey? Are we midway through the journey? My sense is EVs are here. I'm just wondering, I know that there are challenges when it comes to who makes the trucks, where the batteries come from, a lot of different dimensions. But I'm just interested in the transition issues of where, to give our audience an understanding of where we are in the journey. Right? Are we early? Are we mid? Or are we late?
We're very early in the journey in terms of electrification of trucks. So the passenger EVs is a little bit better, but we're very much at the very beginning.
Excellent. Russell, I can't imagine anybody bigger. Maybe IKEA is. I'm not sure yet. But when it comes to FedEx and you think about fleets and EV transitions, you must be in the middle of it. Let me ask you the same question. As you look at what you're trying to do with carbon emissions targets and getting to what your company has pledged to, why has the transition of the fleets become such a high priority for you?
So we're actually in a really good place right now because for the first time, we've been dabbling in the electrification space for about 10 or 12 years, and for the first time, the economics and the actual technologies come to play. So we've been dabbling for a number of years, and now we're at the point where we're ready to scale. So we're truly at a place where pickup and delivery fleet on its face is the right duty cycle and the right type of fleet to be able to expedite and scale electrification across the board. It ties into our 2040 zero emissions, carbon neutrality goals. And at the same time, the technologies came so far that we're ready now to move away from science projects into a full scale execution of a scaled electrification strategy globally.
And how much of this I've talked to your CEO before, Fred Smith, about his obsession with energy independence in America and finding ways that we can decrease dependence. When it comes to marrying both domestically produced electricity and energy married to carbon neutral or carbon zero strategies within the kind of empire of FedEx, do you need anything more from government, or do you have it pretty much all squared away?
Well, one of the things that's different for fleets, and a lot of times people forget, when you're putting in a vehicle in your garage, it's the equivalent of putting a dryer plug in your house, right? So basically, it's a really small project. When you start looking at electrification for a company like FedEx at the scale we're talking about globally, where you're putting in a dryer plug, when I put in electric vehicles into one of our stations, because we do charge internally, it's the equivalent of me building a small subdivision inside of a building. So one of the keys for us is to continue to work with our utility partners and other regulatory agencies to make sure that we, in fact, can get the energy available to us. We also have to look, unfortunately, around the world for our, generating our own energy where it makes sense. We do some of that out in California now with solar and bloom boxes and such, to where we can expand and use microgrid technology to offset any vacancies we have. But at the end of the day, energy independence is a key component to our thinking for many years. It's kind of what started this journey. The good news is we're the perfect type of fleet to be able to do that home delivery, last mile kind of fleet in the pickup and delivery space, which pushed us to our current goal of, by 2025, 50% of our purchases globally of our pickup and delivery fleet will be electric, and then by 2030, 100%, giving us a full electric fleet by 2040. So it's a really exciting time. And fortunately, from a sheer physics perspective, we're in a good place in most of the industrialized world. The U.S. is in a good place. The hardest part is there's thousands of utilities, and getting them all in alignment with what we're trying to do with generation, distribution, and of course the transmission, and making sure that we have viable infrastructure where we're trying to put our facilities.
And Stephen, thank you for that, Russell. Stephen, you're already running EV vehicles, as I understand, in New York, about 40 of them, and we're talking, about a much bigger scale thing here. But, I guess when you're sort of looking at it, one question I sort of have is, what would the world look like if this didn't happen, I guess? I mean, part of me asked, if we weren't going that direction, how screwed would we be? But on the other side, how easy is it to make the transition from IKEA's perspective? A lot of the transition challenges are in part caused because not everything is under a FedEx or under a single brand. You have a lot of independent contractors out there that are running their own system. But give us a perspective on how you see the transition.
Sure. I mean, on one hand, Russell's 100% correct. I mean, the type of fleet that we're talking about, the home delivery fleet, makes a lot of sense for electrification. The technology exists today for that transition. The challenges that we faced on our side, because we do purchase transportation services from third parties, is how do you get those folks to electrify? And then our service providers use independent contractors, like you said, and so these are kind of small, mom and pop type businesses who are generally undercapitalized and risk averse to stuff like buying the first electric vehicle, for example. And by the way, they have no place to park it. So what we've done is we've employed a rental model where we're providing a rental fleet that the contractors then have access to, that they can access those vehicles on a very short-term basis, a day or a week rental, without having to get involved in a long-term financial entanglement. So it's like I like to use a bowling metaphor. If you have to wear bowling shoes, but if you don't have them, you can rent them from the alley. So that's kind of what we've done with our model, is to place the vehicles and give the contractors access to those vehicles on a short-term basis. So that's kind of how we've solved that problem. And then on the infrastructure side, because again we use third parties, we're going to be lighting up more and more of our stores to be able to handle fleet charging, with the hope that eventually our service providers themselves will kind of get on board and start lighting up their own facilities and then offering zero-emission delivery to all of their customers, which would benefit all of us.
Fascinating. Jimmy, I mean, I'm fascinated by CalStart, and I guess, I've been sort of watching, as we all have, the kind of buildup of interest and commitments, and you're talking about a complex ecosystem where lots of different parts of the ecosystem need to be moved to get scale when it comes to electrification and zero-emission vehicles out there. But tell us how CalStart is affecting, changing the environment, in California and elsewhere. I know you've been at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and so you can imagine, how do you go from theory to practice and execution in such a complex space?
Yeah, absolutely. CalStart is really positioned well as an organization that has 250 plus member companies that are really on the front lines of getting this electric technology on the road. And we hear from these fleets, we hear from the OEMs making these trucks, where they're at, what challenges they have, what needs they have. And we go and try to get policies and solutions to help realize this vision that we all share. We are embarking on a new program to really help these small fleets that Stephen mentioned that have challenges that maybe larger fleets don't, to provide resources to get over the information gap and the knowledge gap that a small fleet really doesn't have the time or resources to devote to. So that's a really exciting new program we're launching, Transforming Trucks, Transforming Communities.
And do you have the policy tools you need to get the kind of level of transition you need, or are there missing pieces of the puzzle, so to speak, that you think still need to be put in place?
We know what we need. We know what puzzle pieces exist. We need to put them into place. One big one in conversation right now are financial incentives for electric trucks going on in the budget reconciliation process. There's proposals for electric truck incentives at the federal level, which would be a huge boon and win for this industry to get off the ground. There's currently no federal incentives for electric trucks. We have them for electric cars. And there's a lot of details you can get into about designing those incentives, that how they work for small fleets versus big fleets, a tax credit versus a rebate on the hood, being different proposals out there. That bottom line, we do need financial incentives to help get this industry off the ground.
Well, thank you. Dr. Lin, I'm interested in whether this period of pandemic, so I actually know folks that are truck drivers, and they call me every once in a while. We have chat, and they're out there on the roads in these fleets, and they're moving around the country, but they are all busy. And if you want to become a truck driver right now, you can make a lot of money. I was worried, these automated vehicles are going to come up, these autonomous vehicles move into trucking, and all my friends are going to lose their jobs. But right now, it's a great time if you're a truck driver. Has the pandemic and the demand for shipped goods and products and everything that Russell's company is doing, has that gotten in the way of the transition? Because it seems to me that the capacity probably has the use of the capacity in the U.S. has probably risen in terms of traditional fuel models. But has that gotten in the way of the transition, or is it helping in any way to make the transition to EVs easier?
I actually think it may help. I think that there's the incentive, the market incentive to really help electrify the fleet, because you're getting more deliveries, from the customers. So, and you want to, save the energy cost and the operating costs and things like that. Maybe using the robot delivery, device. And so I think it's, in my opinion, but I think my colleagues here, they are in the industry, they probably have more to say about this. And in my opinion, I think this actually helps.
Well, let me,
to build a little.
Oh, go ahead, Russell.
To build a little bit on what Jane said, one of the big advantages that's happening right now is, frankly, from a total cost of ownership and energy efficiency perspective, electricity is a very good fuel for automotive use, whether it be light commercial duty, your home, your personal car. The end game here is that to get the total cost of ownership to be equal to diesel equivalent or gas equivalent, and we're not that far away. Any help from an incentive perspective to help push us to that diesel equivalency, the TCO of these types of vehicles, the total cost of ownership, is such that it's actually a very efficient, good use from an energy source perspective. So you get the energy independence that we've talked about earlier, and you also get the benefit of a great sustainable overarching use of energy in general. So to build on what Jane said, it's just a very efficient fuel. It's been around for 100 years, and now it's back to the forefront again, based on battery technologies change the face. But basically, it's a good, cost-effective fleet tool. So someone in the fleet business that wants to reduce their overall total cost of ownership, it's a hard sell, but the reality of it is it's the right decision for fleets to make from a financial perspective, with all this huge benefit and basically the changes we can make around the world and how we can impact the global sustainability efforts.
Russell, before I jump to Jimmy and to our other colleagues, let me ask you. You're managing director of global vehicles, so not just the U.S. You have a global scene that you're in charge of. Kind of looking at fleets.
I do.
Where are you buying these? Where are you buying the fleets? Where are you buying the trucks and parts of your fleet and the batteries? Where is it coming from now today?
So right now today, we've just installed and did infrastructure projects in California. We have 1,000 chargers that are EV ready, and we're going to be the launch customer for BrightDrop, which is a GM product. So those will start hitting the streets in California in December. We're basically are committed right now to 500 of those. I anticipate that number becoming much greater than that as we move forward.
Right.
But here in the U.S., we're looking at OEMs, BrightDrop. There are some startups that we've worked with, but at this time, in the U.S., we're going there. China, we're going with a company called Maxis. So basically, from a global perspective, there's a lot of industry advancement being on. All of the large OEMs have made the commitment. They've finally accepted the reality that electricity is going to be a disruptor in their industry, and that they're going to invest literally billions of dollars in the development of these new products. GM is our current partner, but we have different partners around the world. Daimler in Europe, again, Maxis in China. So as we do this from a global perspective, based on the industry and based on the size vehicle, we're kind of purchasing them from all over. So, but most of your OEMs are in place now and have got large EV development programs in place and really moving the technology forward. Now, if we can just beat out this hurdle on utility and make sure that we don't outrun the utility issues, I think that you're gonna really see some movement in this space.
And Stephen, you also have global perspective, and you work for one of the greatest companies in the world that's marketing all over the world. I was just actually on an Alibaba site looking at an IKEA store online, fully 3D in digital form. So, and I ask you again from the global perspective, and let me just, put an edge to it. I'm really interested from the U.S. national perspective, whether we're holding our own, against India, against China and other, Europe, we just met, or are we behind? And if the United States is behind, do you have concerns about that? And I know that's not your job, but I know you have insights into how this, new arena is evolving. Because I think part of this question, the reason people are watching this today is maybe the United States need to wake up and do more and, make the transition and help get the policies in place, help get the financing in place, help GM succeed and maybe other OEMs get involved. But, what's your take on it?
I think so. I mean, I don't think we're behind. I do think China is ahead. if I can put it that way. I think a lot of the countries around the world, my colleagues in other countries, are facing similar challenges to what we're facing here in the United States. Not enough vehicle choices and infrastructure development and working with utilities for upgrades and power and stuff like this. So I think a lot of those challenges are similar. China has had a head start on us for a while. Shanghai was our first city that we electrified, and the government takes a very active role over there in the automotive sector and in regulating areas of major cities that are zero-emission zones, and so that naturally creates its own demand there too. So I think that China is definitely further along on the electrification goals, but and here in the U.S. we have some particular legal environmental challenges around independent contractor regulation and stuff like this. But like Russell said, to me, I'm very optimistic to see our large domestic automobile manufacturers get into the electric truck market with the BrightDrop product or with the Ford E-Transit product, and a lot of other smaller OEMs out there, some of whom we've partnered with already. I think the technology is good, and we're moving forward. But I wouldn't say that we're behind necessarily.
Yeah. Oh God, sometimes you wave the flag you're behind, it helps. And that's why I'm going to go to Jimmy O'Day. But Jimmy O'Day had an interesting tweet, and he said, I don't know what he was responding to, but he said, this is just a fraction of the zero-emission trucks and buses being developed. So he was referring to something, I don't know what that is. But you said there are 56 manufacturers with expected vehicle offerings through 2023, tracked by Team Drive to Zero. So this is the kind of question I want to get at. What does that world look like, Jimmy, of the manufacturers moving in this space, and is the U.S. well positioned, or are we wobbly?
Yeah, what the world looks like is every manufacturer is getting in the game. There's new entrants, the established players. Really, the challenge that you alluded to earlier is availability. And so that tweet was referencing to another tweet where last week I was down in Long Beach at a truck conference. And there was 44 different models of electric trucks on display at this single expo. And I think it was probably the largest single collection of electric trucks, probably in North America, at least that I've ever seen. And so that's incredibly inspiring and encouraging on one hand, that there's 44 different models ranging from small delivery trucks all the way up to Class 8 semi-trucks, on these showroom floors. The challenge is getting those vehicles off the showroom floor and into large-scale production, so fleets like IKEA, FedEx can buy them and put them on the road. And that takes policy. There's policies to require manufacturers to actually make certain fractions of electric trucks that we think are important, in addition to the incentives, in addition to the utility programs that form kind of all those puzzle pieces to the puzzle.
Well, that's cool. Gene, Lynn, I'm going to give you the last word. And it's going to be kind of a funky question, but I'm really interested in your students. I'm interested, when you're teaching students and your sense of the innovation ecosystem around what we're talking about. And is it robust? I mean, I used to, I was in college, my roommate was very active in the Society of Women Engineers, SWE. When you went to a SWE meeting, you kind of got what they were excited about. Are people excited about EV? I mean, I know that all the R&D is not yet done in this world, that there's a lot of, development going on. But in your world, and you're at University of Illinois in Chicago, I mean, is this a hot topic? Do you have trouble getting students? Or are you having to lure them in with candy or something?
Well, it's a hot topic. I think the new generation, they are very much into environmental sustainability. And they're much better informed than when I was at that age. And so, and I think because my area is in transportation sustainability, and students are very much interested in electrification of the fleet, the vehicles, and also the autonomous vehicles, which obviously nowadays is a hot topic area. So the combination, some kind of combination of electrified autonomous vehicles. That's really what the students are excited about.
Well, look, I find it a fascinating conversation. I wish we had a lot more time. And, there are other parts of this. When you kind of look at, big data and quantum computing and 5G and, communications of systems talking to one another, and then you attach that to what you're doing with zero emission fleets. And I mean, FedEx is going to be like, Russell's going to be like Wizard of Oz with this huge, array of interconnected stuff all around. But I'm really, really fascinated. Thank all of you for your thoughts on this. I want to thank Dr. Jane Lin from the University of Illinois, Chicago, Russell Musgrove, Managing Director of Global Vehicles at FedEx Express, Stephen Molk at IKEA, and he is Project Implementation Manager of Zero Emission Delivery Initiatives, and Jimmy O'Day, Deputy Director of Trucks at CalSTART. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now for a message from our sponsor, the Environmental Defense Fund. Please welcome Jason Mathers, Director of Vehicles and Freight Strategy at the Environmental Defense Fund. He's in conversation with Sam Stockdale, Vice President and Head of Environmental and Sustainability at Link Industrial Properties. Jason, over to you.
Thank you for joining us today. I'm Jason Mathers, Senior Director of Vehicle and Freight at Environmental Defense Fund. And today we're joined by Sam Stockdale, Vice President of Environment and Sustainability at Link Industrial Property. Sam, thank you for joining us today and for your leadership in supporting the deployment of zero-emission trucks. Could you maybe start by talking about how Link fits into the transportation landscape and what the company's role is?
Well, I would say one of Link's guiding principles is to leave our assets and communities better than we found them. But what's significant related to the transportation landscape is that we are at the nexus of the country's supply chain. And Link owns over 3,000 distribution industrial assets, facilitating logistics and e-commerce across the country, which puts us right at the pivot point between the real estate sector and the transportation sector, which together account for about 60% of US emissions. And so as a leading landlord and firm, we have a responsibility to operate sustainably. And to that end, we're pursuing many pathways to advance our carbon neutrality and renewable energy goals. And I believe that freight electrification is the future of the supply chain. And so that's an opportunity for us here at Link to use our immense scale to catalyze fleet electrification.
So thank you, Sam. Why has Link partnered with Environmental Defense Fund?
So I would say that most organizations would benefit from a partnership with EDF, but personally, I have a long-standing relationship with EDF over the last 5 or 6 years. And in fact, in my prior life at JP Morgan, we had EDF Climate Corps fellows come on every summer to support our 100% renewable energy goal. And I actually hired one here at Link, Ram Kama, who's one of our aces in the energy economics and data analytics space. But this time around, I've been reading one of your white papers, and I think it was either financing the transition for truck electrification, or it was the fleet electrification case study paper. And I think that same day, I had reached out to Yash, who was managing the Climate Corps program at that time, and said, you got to introduce me to the authors of these papers. And actually, I think that led me to you, Jason. And so, while I couldn't do any justice in explaining those studies, they were by far the deepest accounts of economics related to fleet electrification and other structural barriers to enablement that I've seen to date, or at least they're the best ones that I could make sense of. And so I think aligning with EDF, one of the leading environmental advocacy groups in the world, I see a best-in-class partner to help us think through a thoughtful business case for folding fleet electrification into Link's long-term business planning.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful working with Link, and Link is, a critical player in this ecosystem for developing charging and charging support structures for zero-emission trucks, electric trucks in particular. And I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the barriers that your customers are facing when they are considering electrification.
Absolutely. I would say that there are two main challenges or barriers that come to mind. The first would be initial cost and availability of fully electric vehicles. And early generations are going to be expensive. And many of the fully electric models, particularly those Series 7 and 8 trailers, they're still in prototype phase and won't be rolling off the line or commercially available at scale for a few more years, with the exception of a few 100,000 per year that are in production from the Rivians and the Teslas and the Nikolas, which are largely committed in the near term to large companies who aren't capital constrained. And the second is space for staging and charging. and the energy infrastructure development capital and expertise to build megawatt scale capacity charging stations for fleets will have to be grid connected, which adds a little bit of extra complexity when trying to scale fleet level charging facilities. And so while Link may not be able to solve the first by buying electric fleets for everyone, I think we can be solutions oriented around the second. And in fact, I would say a distribution warehouse could be an ideal place for fleet electrification and staging, both for operator-owned fleets and third-party fleets. And actually, that brings me to one last point I'd like to make, which is that the majority of our customers don't own their fleets. And while it's incredibly encouraging to see many of our Fortune 500 top-tier customers make fleet-related carbon reduction commitments, such as the FedExes and the UPSs and the DHLs and Walmarts, Home Depots, et cetera, this can be a hard-to-reach segment. And it's hard to reach because those mandates have to be picked up by freight partners. And so the other part of this is that the firms I just rattled off tend to be the exception and not the rule. And so not only do the majority of warehouse operators not own their fleets, but a lot of them are small businesses. And at Link, small businesses make up 80% of our customer base. And so our strategy is geared towards ensuring that an amenity exists for those who are first to market, and that we're also providing pathways for the smaller players to plug in when they're ready.
Great. Well, thank you, Sam. And I think it's really an important place for Link and for other warehouse and retail space providers to play in. And one of the policy barriers that we've seen is that a lot of charging infrastructure programs have some simplifying assumptions. And one of those is that the fleet that's purchasing the zero-emission truck, the electric truck, owns the facility and is going to be in that facility for 7 to 10 years, and that's often not the case. And so it's really important to have third-party providers like yourself, in this space and playing an important role in making sure that infrastructure gets in the ground. So with that, I'm wondering, beyond the importance of the service to your customers, why is transportation electrification important to Link?
Oh gosh, I mean, so many things come to mind. I would say, but I guess really two particularly are jumping out at me that you just mentioned, and I think the first is coming back to my very first statement about leaving places better than we found them, is about improving community health. And I think you touched on an important note here in that emissions from idling diesel trucks and distribution centers can have an adverse effect on air quality. And that, combined with the fact that some of our assets are located in at-risk communities, means that there's a possible negative community health impact. And so while we can't choose fleet operators for our customers, we can absolutely facilitate their transition to lower emitting vehicles and therefore improve those communities where we're operating from an environmental perspective in the long term. And so the second is really transparency. And to me personally, sustainability means that we're building a replicable model that others can follow to magnify positive impact. And so our intention is to pave this path to work with EDF specifically to author white papers about our successes and failures, and then to give away that playbook to anyone who wants to know how we did what we did so that they can either iterate or improve upon what we've done for greater uptake. And so we think that's the kind of leadership, and not keeping things for yourself, but asking others to join you is what leads to measurable change.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's I think a really dynamic time, and it's great to have folks like Link, diving in here and developing best practices and being willing to share them so that we can all move further faster. The final question, Sam, is can you talk a bit about what are the short and long-term steps Link is taking to be a core partner in the transition to 100% zero-emission vehicles?
Absolutely. In the short term, I would say that the Link right now, we're building a foundation of research and analysis and partnering with groups like EDF, right, to understand both the project and the energy economics associated with charging infrastructure. We're talking with manufacturers to understand different classification of vehicles, and And we're listening, as you mentioned earlier about public policy, we're listening to those public policy groups to ensure that we've gathered as much intelligence as possible for us to build a cohesive solution for our customers. And I would say that the long-term steps are much more grand, right? So we've mentioned infrastructure a few times throughout this conversation, and we want to enable infrastructure charging and staging where practical, and also offsite from fleet charging and staging facilities across hubs on high density freight routes across the country. And so we really want to not just be a progressive partner in this space, but we want to be the tip of the spear and create that playbook and roadmap, as you mentioned.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. And I think that's really as EDF thinks about our work in this space. We think about kind of two key areas where we're pushing. One is for driving near-term deployment of vehicles, and clearly Link has an important role there in the place you have in the charging ecosystem. And the other one is putting forward, securing the policies we need to, accelerate this transition. And as I think about, the work that Link is doing, one of the things that I see as a point of connection between these two is the important role that public policy has in enabling companies like Lyft to make the bold investments that are necessary, to develop the charging infrastructure and the supporting ecosystem that zero-emission trucks need. With that, Sam, I'd just like to thank you for taking the time today to talk to us and for your investment of time continuing to drive help drive the future of zero-emission trucks in the U.S.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Joining us now is Congressman Garrett Graves, ranking member of the Select Committee on Climate and member of the Conservative Climate Caucus. Congressman, you become a leading voice on the Republican position on climate. Thanks so much for taking time out of your crazy schedule. And I just have to tell our audience right now, this is a very human moment. A lot of drama, a lot of tragedy already in Louisiana. I know you were out responding to Hurricane Ida. You have another hurricane coming in. And so can you give us a snapshot of what you're seeing? Because I know that's top of mind for you right now.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate your sensitivity there. The Hurricane Ida was incredible. We had winds clocked as high as 194 miles an hour, storm surge as high as 15 feet, and peak rain load appears to be around 18 inches. Any one of those could have been a disaster for many of our communities across the United States. Getting hit with the trifecta has just been devastating. So we still have a huge swath of the state without electricity. We have a lot of areas that don't have cell service, don't have internet connection, no water or wastewater systems. And to see it going on for this extended period in America in 2021 is just incredible. I mean, literally the hurricane came in and just wiped the earth of communities in some areas in South Louisiana. So a lot of recovery work going on, a lot of efforts by our first responders and others to try and get folks back to stable conditions. But I appreciate your sensitivity and making note of the challenges we're dealing with down here.
Well, look, I think it's almost in a way unfair, and I'm really grateful to you to let us have a conversation, because we're talking today about electric vehicles and trucks and fleets and shippers, and you're in the middle of a real crisis down there. But I think it gives us an opportunity as well to step back for a moment and say, what should we be learning from this? When it comes to talking about the infrastructure bill and getting it right, when it comes to thinking about the future of energy and also thinking about climate change, and I know you're on the conservative end of this, but I know these are issues you care about. What do you feel ought to be top of mind for us as we think about not tomorrow, but 5 years, 10 years down the road when it comes to these new big investments?
Sure. Well, look, there's no question, and I can show you areas down here where it really makes the case for this. You can either spend millions before a disaster improving resiliency, or you can spend billions after picking up the pieces. And we had a huge investment in 5 parishes or our county equivalent around the New Orleans area. And that system, that levee and protection system, performed very well. Had it not been in place, we would see billions of extra dollars in damages, and we would see countless lives that would have been lost. But then directly over to the west of that area, where there's very little to no levee protection, that is where you saw, or we now see, devastation. So there's no question that these these resiliency or these investments in resiliency make sense. And that goes to ecological resiliency, structural, non-structural communities, all of it.
When it comes to thinking about the future of EVs and electric vehicle, electrifying everything, I know you've been worried about electricity shortages in the future, but how do you get the balance? I mean, that's where the tilt is going. And so how do you get that right? Because, you know, when you kind of look at Louisiana now, you look at the long gas lines, you look where people are, where they are today, are EVs a potential piece of a response down the road?
Well, we don't have electricity, so you know, you could drive until the batteries went dead, just like folks can drive their vehicles until they run out of gas. So we've had a number of gas trucks coming down, fuel trucks headed down to our communities, and folks literally taking fuel straight off the trucks in some areas. That's been a real savior. You know, look, I think in regard to EVs, you know, taking it out of the disaster realm for just a minute, there's a role for EVs. There's no doubt. I actually have two, maybe getting a third, and they make sense in limited cases. But if you're a long haul truck driver, if you're used to driving and pulling a load like a horse trailer or a boat, it really isn't a viable option today because its performance can't even begin to compare with that of a combustion engine in terms of the length that it can drive, the distance that it can drive, or the power that combustion engines have. You can even look at EVs today where they're utilized, and they're normally driven somewhere between 1/2 and 1/3 the mileage of regular combustion vehicles. It's normally a second or a third car for folks, and it normally is folks that are in, as you've seen from various analysis, from people that are in the higher economic or wage earner categories.
You know, I think the first time we encountered each other was about 15 years ago after Hurricane Katrina. You were such a big part of bringing the community together, rebuilding after that. And I'm interested, you know, both now, you know, this is a constant story, right? So as you have the Builder Act, that's Garrett Graves' Act, the Builder Act, and you're kind of looking at infrastructure and how to be smart about it. What are the dimensions of that you want the Biden administration to take seriously so that we make smart moves as you see it on infrastructure?
You know, people have great infrastructure ideas all over the place. And it could be, let's make investments in clean energy infrastructure. Let's revise our electricity grid to be able to facilitate these new green energy or clean energy projects moving forward. Or it could be, we need to make investments in the resiliency of our coastal ecosystem. We need to make investments in the resiliency of our coastal communities. But today, the amount of time that it takes to actually go from concept to construction is absurd. And having worked on these projects most of my life, I can tell you that there are projects that we've worked on that have been stuck in this pre-construction phase, not just for years, but for decades. And these are projects like trying to restore our coastal wetlands, trying to build levee or restore levee protection from communities. And I'm glad you brought up Hurricane Katrina, because that's an example of where we got a waiver from a lot of these constraints or a lot of these studies and analysis. And it worked really well. It worked well for the environment, and it allowed for an efficient construction process. And so it really is an example of a win-win. The Builder Act stays focused on actually implementing and getting to the outcome of these projects, whether they're, again, ecological restoration projects or community resilience projects or road projects. It stays focused on the objective. Let's get these things built, and let's have that proper balance of project outcome and environmental protection.
Let me get another question. You know, you and I have talked about it last time we spoke about communities. Because a lot of times when you have new investment, and part of the question is, how do you make it inclusive? We have communities of color and others have been left on the sidelines of this. You have a lot of folks down in Louisiana that may live in places where you don't have the energy projects, and you've got, you know, transportation challenges within the state of Louisiana. Does the infrastructure bill become a potential bridge to begin to help people get where the jobs are, or is that naive on my part?
Well, look, I want to be clear that we need additional infrastructure investments in the United States, and it's not a scenario where you can't afford to do it. It's a scenario that you can't afford not to. And an example is, for Hurricane Katrina, we probably could have saved well over $100 billion with a B, $100 billion by investing somewhere around $8 billion on the front end, actually improving the resilience of the communities and saving well over 1,000 lives if that investment had been made. So I'm a big proponent of making the right smart investments in infrastructure. The problem with the infrastructure bill is that the administration has, for example, in the Corps of Engineers said, we're not going to fund any projects that benefit oil and gas. Well, that you can't come out with that blanket statement. What happens if you have a refinery in a disadvantaged community? Does that mean the disadvantaged community suffers and you're not going to fund a resiliency project in that area? Or, for example, the Department of Transportation under Secretary Buttigieg has said that we're going to prioritize projects that benefit environmental justice, racial equity, or climate change. While I may be fully supportive of the objectives, transportation projects aren't the tool to solve those problems, and you're manipulating criteria to achieve your political goals, not what truly is the best return on investment for taxpayers. So I want an infrastructure bill. I want to increase infrastructure spending, but using these political criteria to manipulate who the winners and losers are, that's a big problem for Louisiana. I think it's a big problem for the nation.
Garrett, just finally, when I just got back from Europe and was talking to people about EVs, the infrastructure going on there, trucks, fleet, shippers, what's going on that front in the European context. If you go to Asia and look at what China is investing in and doing and wanting to yet again find a strategic space to dominate and be in, it's very clear that China and some other Southeast Asian nations are making big investment in this arena. I'm just interested from your perspective, whether the combination of the private sector and the government and these businesses that are going to deploy huge fleets, when it comes to the future of EVs, are we doing it the right way? Because my sense is we're behind. And I'm wondering if there are any warning flags going off among you or your colleagues about that.
I agree that there are warning signs going on all over the place. And I think the warning signs are really that you're right that China, Asia, and other countries are making huge investments in some of these EV and green energy technologies because they don't have the natural resources that we do in the United States. Instead of being focused on, I want everything to be solar or everything to be wind, what we need to be focused on is a clean energy future. And if we can base a clean energy future on resources that are in the United States versus those that are in China or controlled by China, that's a win-win for the United States. On the one hand, this administration's out there facilitating pipelines to transport Russian natural gas into Europe. On the other hand, they're stopping natural gas from being transported in the United States. We've got to focus our clean energy future on our own resources. We've got to look at America like a not-for-profit or a company. You base your strategic plan upon your assets and strengths. I'm afraid that what's happening right now is we're basing our strategic plan on the strengths of China and Russia. We're playing into their hands. We really need to recalibrate that strategy and have a clean energy future based on America's resources. We've led the world in reducing emissions over about the last 17 years, and I'm confident we can continue leading the world, but we've got to do it in a strategic way. And I think that's going to we're going to have to take a step back and be very thoughtful about what that is, because I think we're playing into the jaws of China right now.
Look, folks, I want everybody to know that this exchange I just had with Congressman Graves is practically a miracle, because he got broadband, he got electricity to be able to do this. Hurricane Ida is serious, and it's an area of great stress. We're very grateful. Congressman Garrett Graves, ranking member, the Select Committee on Climate, Crisis, Transportation, and Infrastructure Committee, and a member of the Conservative Climate Caucus. Thanks so much for joining us today, and best of luck on everything you're doing to help folks down there during this very stressful time and what's coming up again.
Thank you. Bless you.
What a great show. That brings us to the end of our program. A big thank you to the Environmental Defense Fund for its support for all of these programs. We've done 3 of them now, and to all of you attendees for joining this discussion and the other ones we've done. For those of you who have missed any of these conversations, we'll have the video up from these events up on our website shortly. I'm Steve Clemens. Be well.